As researchers in psychology and neuroscience, we often find ourselves tasked with creating experiments where we present stimuli to the participant and record their responses. Nowadays, this is mostly done on a computer or a mobile device with the help of specialized software. In this tutorial, we will take a look at one such toolbox called PsychoPy. Just a quick disclaimer, this video is meant for complete beginners who have never used PsychoPy or similar tools. My goal here is to introduce you to the software and walk you through the installation process to help you get started. To get the most out of this, I recommend that you grab your laptop and follow along with the video. By the end of it, you will have PsychoPy installed on your machine. You will understand what it is and what its various components allow you to do. You will be able to launch and run a pre-existing experiment, and finally you will gain some basic understanding of how to make your own experiment in PsychoPy. So without further ado, let's get started. So what is PsychoPy? In short, it's a free open source package for designing and running experiments in psychology and neuroscience. And fun fact, it was actually created by a St. Andrews psychology graduate. PsychoPy is written in and for Python, hence the Pi in its name. But unlike most other Python packages, it is extremely easy to set up. It's literally as simple as installing an app. PsychoPy provides a beginner-friendly graphical interface, as well as standard Python scripting capabilities for some more advanced users. It supports a wide range of stimulus types, including text, images, sounds, and video, as well as various input devices such as keyboards, mice, microphones, etc. PsychoPy is best suited for running studies locally in person, but it also has some options for putting your experiments online. In this tutorial though, we won't be covering any of its online functionality, focusing instead on the basics of PsychoPy. Let's start by installing PsychoPy. To do this, simply open your browser, go to psychopy.org, and under Download tab, navigate to the Install page. At the top of the page, you'll find a button for downloading the standalone version of PsychoPy. Standalone simply means that once you install it, the app will work on its own without you having to download anything extra. This button will always recommend the latest release for your machine, so depending on whether you're a Mac, Windows, or Linux user, you'll automatically get the correct installation file for your system. So go ahead and click on it, and since the file is quite large, it might take some time to download. But once you have it, you will only need to follow the standard installation procedures for your machine. So on a Mac, you will double click on your freshly installed .dmg or disk image file, wait for it to open, and then drag and drop the app icon into the applications folder. PsychoPy will now be available for you to launch from the applications folder, and the disk image on your desktop will need to be ejected by right-clicking on it and selecting Eject. Similarly, on a Windows machine, you will double-click on the executable file to run the installer, confirm that you want to allow the app to make changes to your device, and go through your standard installation wizard settings. You can confirm the default location, agree to terms and conditions, and click Install to finalize it. The app will now be ready to launch from the Start menu. When you launch PsychoPy, it may look slightly different on Mac versus Windows, but it will always open the same three windows: the builder, the coder, and the experiment runner. So let's go ahead and explore each of them in a bit more detail. First, the builder. This is the graphical interface of PsychoPy that you can use to create experiments without doing any of the coding. It lets you use its building blocks, which are essentially just customizable templates for stimuli and responses and ways of putting them together to make simple experiments. We'll look at it in a bit more detail later on, but for now, just think of it as the window where you're going to be doing most of your work. The builder is not the only window for creating experiments in PsychoPy, though. To the more advanced users, PsychoPy offers the coder interface, which is a code editor where you can write experiments from scratch using Python programming language. This is obviously more advanced and may be kind of intimidating if you're just starting out, but it does allow you a lot more freedom and flexibility with what you can do. One thing to note is that although builder and coder may seem very different, the experiments created in them actually run in the exact same way. So when you run a builder experiment, PsychoPy creates a Python script file and executes it to run the task as if it was written in coder. To see this in action, you can open any builder experiment and click the Compile to Script button in the top toolbar. This will create a Python script file with .py extension in the same location as your builder file. You can then view the code of your experiment in the coder window or any other code editor. Keep in mind that if you make any edits to the script, they will not be reflected in the original builder experiment, nor will you be able to turn this updated code back into a builder file. The builder to coder conversion in PsychoPy only works one way, so unfortunately, you can't freely switch between them. Finally, we have the experiment runner, which has two main functions, logging and scheduling. First of all, it shows you live updates of what's happening in your experiment as it's running, which includes any errors or warnings that might prevent it from working correctly. Second, the runner lets you create sets of experiments, which is very useful if you created multiple tasks in PsychoPy and you want to automatically present them one after the other. Alright, so now that we know what each window does, let's use them to run some experiments. The experiments created in Builder are saved as files with a .psyexp extension, so you can easily tell them apart from coder files that end with .py. We'll start by learning how to run an existing experiment in Builder. Usually, an experiment will be given to you inside a folder. It's very important that you don't delete, move, or rename anything inside that folder. At least not until you have a very good understanding of the experiment and PsychoPy itself. So to open your Builder file, navigate to the Builder window and click Open an existing experiment, which will bring up a file selection window. Navigate to the folder that houses your task and select the .psyexp experiment file. You're halfway there. Once the file loads, go ahead and click Run Experiment in the top toolbar. Now, give your experiment time to load. PsychoPy is infamously slow, so you might have to wait a minute or so. Depending on the structure of the experiment, you might see a pop-up window asking you to enter some task parameters. Almost always, you will be asked to enter participant ID that will be used to name the data files. Once you click OK, your experiment should open in a new window. If you want to quit the experiment before it's over, you can usually press the escape key on your keyboard. This should work most of the time unless this has been specifically disabled in experiment settings. Once you've completed or quit the experiment, you'll likely want to have a look at your data. You will usually find it in the data subfolder in the same location as the task file. As a rule, it will have the date, time, and experiment name in the title, as well as the participant ID you entered at the start of the experiment. Trial-by-trial responses will usually be saved as an Excel or CSV file, and depending on the experiment settings, you might also find some log files, which can be useful for troubleshooting and debugging the experiment if something does go wrong with it. So now you know how to run an existing Builder experiment. But what if the file given to you is a coder script? Well, let's open up the coder and find out. In the top ribbon, click on the file icon that says Open and select your task file. Remember that it needs to have the .py extension. Once the file has been selected, click Open. Doing this will open up the Python script in a new tab of the coder window. You can then go ahead and click Run Experiment in the toolbar. It might be obvious to those of you familiar with programming, but it's worth noting that Coder isn't limited to running experiments. Since all it is a Python environment, you can use it to write and execute scripts that do anything, from restructuring or analyzing your data to maybe creating stimuli for your tasks. The Coder is simply a code editor, and if you know a little bit of Python, the possibilities here are truly endless. What happens after you click the run button is very much dependent on the file that you're running. Make sure to read the documentation that comes with the file to know what to expect. If something goes wrong with your task, your first step should always be to inspect the output. The Output tab is typically located below the Editor section under Shelf. Most of the time, if PsychoPy runs into some issues, the error messages will appear in this section. If that happens, make sure to take note of the output and share it with the school technicians along with the file that you're trying to run, just to help them diagnose the problem. It might also help to tell them what operating system your computer is using and what version of PsychoPy you have on your machine. To access that information, go to the Help drop-down menu and select System Info, which will bring up a window with all sorts of specifications, which you can then share with whoever is helping you. For now, let's go back to the Builder interface and explore it in a bit more detail. The Builder window consists of a toolbar and 3 panes: Routines, Components, and Flow. The Components pane contains the smallest building blocks for your experiment, namely various types of stimuli and responses. Aside from these more basic options, the Components pane also offers some advanced elements, such as code snippets, eye tracking controls, and components for synchronizing your experiment with EEG data. You can find out more about each of these by simply hovering over them with your cursor. To add a new element to your experiment, simply click on its icon to bring up a Properties window. Here you can customize everything about your stimulus, from its appearance and timing to its name and position on the screen. Note that you can always go back and change these settings later, so don't worry about getting them all right from the start. To finalize it, click the OK button in the bottom right of the window, and the component will be added to your experiment. This new component will now appear in the Routines pane. In PsychoPy, routines can be thought of as slightly larger building blocks that themselves consist of multiple elements. So something like a single trial in an experiment where you show some stimuli and get a response would be considered a routine. This pane allows you to examine each routine individually and switch between them by clicking on tabs with routine names displayed on them. The Routines pane displays the timeline for when each element will appear and disappear. You can also click anywhere on your existing components to go back to that Properties window we saw earlier and make changes to those settings. You can also right-click on the components to copy, delete, or move them up and down in the routine, which for visual elements works kind of like PowerPoint layers, with those placed on top overlaying the elements below them. You can also rename your individual routines and change some of their settings by clicking on Routine Settings at the top left corner of the page. Now, to string your multiple routines together and use them to create a whole experiment, you can use the Flow pane. This is the most zoomed out, big picture view of your experiment, where you can see the order in which your routines will play out. Here you can also repeat routines by creating loops, which we'll cover in a bit. Finally, the toolbar at the top houses some buttons for managing your experiments, as well as editing some high-level settings. The options under File and Edit allow you to create, open, and save files, as well as undo and redo your last action. As a side note, you can also access all of these from the File and Edit drop-down menus. You then have access to some more advanced settings, such as monitor calibration and experiment settings. The most important things to note within experiment settings are hidden under Basic and Data tabs. Under Basic, you can change your experiment name and toggle the escape key functionality for quitting the experiment. As always, you can learn more about each option by hovering over them with your cursor. Under Data, you can select the types of files you want to save to document your experiment, such as Excel or CSV. For example, if you're interested in recording responses on every single trial, the correct option to enable would be the Save CSV trial by trial. Of course, there are many more settings you can change, but if you're just starting out, you don't have to worry about it. the default settings have got you covered. We then have the experiment mode switch, which controls whether the current task will be presented in pilot or run mode. This mostly has implications for how the task window appears when you run the experiment. As a rule of thumb, when you're designing an experiment, you want to keep it in pilot mode until you're ready to do your final checks and test participants. To the right from the mode switch, we have a Send to Runner button, which comes in handy if you have multiple experiments and want to automatically schedule them one after another. Then, under Desktop, you'll find Compile and Run buttons, which we've already used earlier in the video. The rest of the toolbar options are only useful if you're running your study online, so we won't be covering them today. Now that you know your way around Builder, it's time to try your hand at making your first experiment. For this example, we'll be building a simple version of the Stroop task. In this experiment, we want to show participants some color names written in colorful fonts. On some trials, the color of the font will match the color name, such as the word red appearing in red, while on others there will be a mismatch, such as the word red appearing in blue. We want to ask participants to indicate the color of the font they're seeing and not the meaning of the word. Of course, this will be a lot harder to do when the font color doesn't match the meaning. To get started, let's break this down even further by laying out exactly what needs to happen on every trial. Let's say that the trial starts with a 1 second long wait screen where nothing is really happening and participants are fixating on a cross in the middle of the screen. We then want to present our stimulus, a word for a color name written in a colorful font. We want it to replace the cross in the middle of the screen, and we want it to stay there indefinitely until participants actually provide a response. So finally, we need to collect that response. Something like a key press would work pretty well in this scenario, and we could have different keys correspond to different colors. In terms of timing, we want this to become available at the same time as the stimulus and stay available until a response is given. And then we want all of this to happen again with a new stimulus and repeat however many times we need to get our data. Let's say 27 times in total, okay? So what we have here is the basic structure for our experiment, which we can now take into PsychoPy and slowly build up from scratch. Let's open Builder and start by adding some components. You'll see that by default, the empty routine that you start with is called trial, which is precisely what it's about to become. We want our trial to start with a fixation period, so let's add a fixation cross. From Components, under Stimuli tab, we're going to select Polygon. We're going to name it Fixation, and we're going to change its shape to a cross. And finally, we will carefully check the timing. It should start at the very beginning of the trial, so at 0 seconds, and we want it to disappear after 1 second, so the stop time should be 1. This all seems okay, so we can go ahead and click OK. Next, we're going to add the stimulus. Let's select text from the Components pane, call it Stimulus, and straight away let's change our timing. We want the stimulus to appear right after the cross, so let's set the start time to 1 second, and we want it to stay on the screen forever, until the response is given. So to do that, we'll simply delete everything from the stop duration field. And finally, let's look at the bottom field title text. As an example, let's type in a color name, let's say red, and finally let's set the font color. We'll go to the Appearance tab and click on the little color slider icon next to the top field. We'll scroll down until we find a color we like. Let's say we want the basic red. Then we'll click Insert and then OK. We can see immediately that the stimulus has been added to our trial and scheduled to appear at 1 second, just as the fixation cross disappears. Great! Finally, let's add our response. We're going to go down to, you guessed it, Responses, and select Keyboard. We can call it response and change its timing to match that of the stimulus, so start at 1 second and keep the stop field empty. Now, and this is very important, we have to make sure that the force end of routine box is ticked. Otherwise, the trial will go on forever, even after the participant has responded. So ticking this ensures that the trial ends the moment we get a response. Lastly, let's specify the keys that count as a valid response. Let's say that in this task we're going to have 3 possible colors, red, blue, and green, so we'll need 3 different keys. For simplicity's sake, let's just use some arrow keys. As you can see, some of these are already listed under allowed, so we can simply edit this field. We'll keep left and right and delete the rest, and we'll simply add up as our third option. It's very important that we keep formatting the same with single quotes around each word and commas separating words. Otherwise, PsychoPy won't know what to do with this. Alright, let's click OK and check what we have so far. PsychoPy doesn't have a preview function, so we're just going to have to save and run the experiment. Let's click Save As and set up a new folder called Stroop_experiment. We'll call our file the same thing, and you'll notice that the play button that we've used earlier is now orange instead of green. Well, that's because when you make a new experiment, PsychoPy automatically puts it into so-called pilot mode. This is useful for when you're testing things out, since it shows the task in a smaller window without going full screen. So we'll keep it on for now, but we'll switch it off later by toggling the switch located in the top panel. For now, let's click Run and see what happens. By default, PsychoPy will ask you to enter a participant name and a session number. You don't have to change this, so just click OK. Well, that cross is way too big, so we're going to have to change that. And we're also going to have to change the size of the word, because right now it's way too small. Let's test our responses. I'm going to press left, and the experiment should end. Great! Obviously, this doesn't really look like the task we want. For once, it only has 1 trial, so let's go back and make some changes. We'll click on our fixation component and go to Layout. The current size is way too big, so let's change it to something like 0.1 by 0.1. Next, let's change the text size. So click on the stimulus component and go to Formatting. Here we'll edit our letter height to something like 0.2 and click OK. Finally, let's add some trials. Earlier, we've decided that we want our task to have 27 trials. That is to say, we want our trial routine to repeat 27 times. To do this, let's go to the flow pane at the bottom of the page and click Insert Loop. You'll see a little gray dot appear before the trial routine on the timeline. To clarify, this dot is fully movable, so if you move your cursor to the right, the dot will also shift. But let's bring it back to the start of the timeline for now and click on it. And you'll see that a second dot appears on the other side of the trial routine. You'll also see this window called Loop Properties that should pop up somewhere on your screen. We'll keep the name as it is, make sure that Is Trials box is ticked, and we'll go ahead and change the number of repeats to 27. Okay, let's try running the task again and see what's changed. Let's save the task and then click Run. The sizes are looking a lot better, and if we press one of our keys, yep, the task doesn't end, and instead we're getting the repeat of the trial. This is already much better than what we had last time, but it's still not quite what we want. You might have noticed by now, but all the trials in this experiment are the same. This isn't exactly surprising because, well, that's how we've programmed it, right? We made one trial with red as the word and red as the font color, and we set it to repeat 27 times. But let's see how we can add some variation to our trials by setting a new word and a new color on every single trial. To do this, we're going to have to create a spreadsheet that will tell the program what settings to use on every trial. So let's leave PsychoPy for a moment and jump into Microsoft Excel. Here, let's open a new workbook and think back to the task we were trying to create. So we've previously decided to have 3 colors in our experiment: red, green, and blue. For each color, there will be a word that spells out its name and a font color. Since there's 3 of each, there can be 9 possible combinations of font color and word meaning. That means our experiment can have 9 unique conditions, and we're going to use this Excel file to tell PsychoPy exactly what they are. Let's start by creating columns called word and font underscore color. For a word that spells out red, we can have 3 possible font colors: red, green, and blue. And the same goes for green and blue. So that gives us our 9 conditions, and technically we could already stop here. But wouldn't it be great to also know what the answer should be? Well, let's add a new column called correct underscore answer and stop here for a second. We're now going to have to decide the key correspondences and make sure to keep track of that information as to not get confused later. Let's say that for our experiment, left arrow will mean red, the up arrow will mean green, and the right arrow will mean blue. Again, these are completely arbitrary, so it's worth writing them down somewhere to remind yourself what they mean later. We'll be asking participants to respond to font color as opposed to the word meaning, so let's go ahead and specify the correct key for every condition based on font color. This is already enough information for PsychoPy to show different conditions and keep track of correct answers, but this file can actually contain more than that. Let's say that in our data analysis, we want to compare participants' performance on trials where meaning and font color are matched, with trials where they are mismatched. We can actually code that information straight into this file to make sure we have it in our resulting data files. So let's go ahead and create a column called match, where we can put 1 for trials where font and meaning match, and 0 for trials where they don't match. It's kind of like 1 stands for true and 0 for false. Again, you should keep track of that information somewhere to make sure you know what you're looking at during analysis. So now let's save this workbook as trial underscore conditions and make sure to put it in our experiment folder. We can then go back to PsychoPy and finish setting up our experiment. Down in the flow panel, let's click on our trials loop and then on the little folder icon next to the row that says conditions. Then we'll find the file that we've just created and select it. Now, attention. We're going to go back to the nreps field, which we've previously changed, and we're going to set it to 3. This will give us 3 repetitions of each condition, so with 9 trial conditions, we'll end up with 27 trials in total. Note that the trials will be presented in a random order since our loop type is set to random. Okay, we're almost done here. There's only one more thing we have to do for our trials to work. Let's click on our stimulus and revisit the bottom field that controls the content of the text box. Instead of red, we're going to type in a $sign and word in lowercase, which, as you might recall, is the name of the column in our conditions spreadsheet that contains color names. So putting it here with a $sign in front of it essentially tells PsychoPy to go to the file specified in loop preferences, find a column called word, and put the values from that column into the text box. To make sure that the condition changes on every trial, we're going to navigate to this box that says constant and instead select set every repeat. Great. We're now going to repeat that same procedure for font color. So go to appearance and instead of the current value of foreground color, we'll type in $sign and font underscore color to match the column name in our file. We're also going to set this to set every repeat. We're almost there. Now let's repeat this procedure for our response component to make sure it can access that correct answer column. So we'll click on Response and select the Data tab. We're going to tick the box next to Store Correct, and in the correct answer field, type in $correct_answer. Okay, let's save and run our task again to make sure everything's working as expected. As you can see, we now have some random variation when it comes to our trials. Both the text and the font color are changing, which means that everything is working as it should. Good job! One last thing we're going to do is add the instruction screen. We're using some arbitrary keys to collect responses, so it's a good idea to share them with participants at the start of the task. To do this, we're going to create a new routine, so click Insert Routine, select New, and call it Instructions. You'll notice that gray dot again, and we're going to place it at the very start of the timeline outside of the trial loop. In this routine, we're going to add a text component called Instruction Text that will start at 0 and not have a stop time. And we're also going to add a keyboard response component called Instruction Key with space as the only allowed response. Just like before, it will start at the same time as the text, have no stop time, and is going to have force and routine box ticked. That way, when participants are done reading instructions, they can hit that space and start the task. Now let's go back to the text component and write some instructions. I'll just say, welcome to Stroop task. Use arrow keys to indicate the color of the font. Left means red, up is green, and right is blue. Press space to begin. Okay, let's save and run this one last time to see if it worked. Great! We now have an instruction screen, and if we press space, we can see the trials. Congratulations on making your first PsychoPy experiment. You're now ready to go and collect some data. When testing participants, make sure to put your experiment into run mode by toggling that switch in the top panel. This will remove the orange pilot border from the task window and present it in full screen mode. And that brings us to the end of this tutorial. You've made great progress, and I hope this brief introduction gives you the confidence to keep learning on your own. So to end this video, I'd like to point you to some really great resources that you can access online for free that will help you gain a deeper understanding of PsychoPy. If you'd like to continue learning about the Builder interface, I highly recommend checking out the Learn section on PsychoPy's official website, psychopy.org. If you click on Workshops and scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page, you'll be able to access teaching materials created by the PsychoPy team for their workshops and boot camps. And if you go to their official YouTube page, you will find some of that same information in video format. I also recommend going to Jason Ozupko's channel on YouTube for some really easy to follow hands-on builder tutorials. If you're not sure where to start, I'd like to highlight his two-part series called Getting Started with PsychoPy, as well as your first PsychoPy experiment for a more in-depth dive into what we've covered today. Finally, to get a better idea of the types of experiments you can create in Builder, I highly recommend checking out the demos that come with your installation of PsychoPy. To access them, navigate to the Demos menu in Builder and click Unpack Demos. Make a new folder to house all of the materials and select it to continue. A few seconds later, you should be able to see some new folders appear in your selected location, and if you navigate to the one called Experiments, you should see a bunch of subfolders named after all kinds of different paradigms. To get a brief description of any given experiment, go into its folder and open up the README file. Then you can go back to your Builder window and open its corresponding file by going to Demos and Experiments and selecting the name of the task. This is a great way to learn how to make the most out of Builder, and I encourage you to explore as many of these as you can, even if they don't seem directly relevant to you at first. Now, since PsychoPy is a Python-based tool, you might also want to learn some basic Python programming. Thankfully, there's plenty of great tutorials out there, most of which you would be able to follow in the Coder window. If you're a complete beginner and you're looking for a free course to get you started, I recommend checking out Network Chuck on YouTube and his series called Python Right Now. And if you're looking for something a bit more formal and in-depth, you can check out this 4.5-hour long course by freecodecamp.org on YouTube titled Python for Beginners. These are just a few examples of excellent free resources you can find online, so feel free to get out there and explore on your own. I wish you best of luck in your PsychoPy journey, and I hope you found this video helpful. Bye for now.